Freen Becky. Marriage as a feeling, not a ceremony. Introduction. When love stops asking for witnesses. For most of human history, marriage has been something you prove. You prove it with rings, with vows, with witnesses, with documents stamped and approved. Marriage has been treated as a public performance, something that only becomes real once it is seen, named, and sanctioned. But quietly, especially in modern queer spaces, a different understanding has been taking shape. One where marriage is not a ceremony, not a legal status, not a public announcement, but a feeling of choosing and being chosen, feeling of safety, a feeling of emotional home. This is where the story of Freen Becky begins to matter in a way that goes far beyond fandom, rumors, or speculation. Because what people saw in Freen and Becky was not a wedding. It was something deeper. It was marriage energy without the ceremony. The limits of traditional marriage definitions. To understand why Freen Becky resonates so powerfully, we must first acknowledge a truth many people avoid. Traditional marriage definitions are narrow. They center heterosexual norms, public validation, social approval, institutional control. They often leave little room for privacy, ambiguity, emotional nuance, queer realities. For LGBTQ+ people especially, marriage has never been just about love. It has been about permission. Permission to exist. Permission to commit. Permission to be taken seriously. And even today, in many parts of the world, that permission is still denied. So when people talk about marriage in queer contexts, they are often not talking about a ceremony. They are talking about recognition without danger. Why queer communities learned to see marriage differently? Because legal and social marriage was inaccessible for so long, queer people learned to recognize commitment in other ways. They learned to see marriage in shared routines, emotional labor, consistency over time, a mutual protection, quiet devotion. Queer love evolved a different language, one that doesn't always rely on public confirmation. And that language is exactly what fans recognized in Freen Becky. Freen Becky. A connection that never performed for approval. What made Freen and Becky different from many public pairings was not intensity. It was ease. They did not rush to define themselves. They did not dramatize their closeness. They did not turn intimacy into spectacle. Instead, what fans saw over time was emotional attunement, an unforced physical comfort, a mutual awareness, a shared rhythm. They existed like two people who had already negotiated their place in each other's lives. Quietly. That kind of bond does not come from contracts. Comes from trust. Marriage as a feeling. What does that actually mean? When fans say they feel married, they are not being literal. They are describing a recognizable emotional state. Marriage as a feeling looks like calm instead of chaos, a familiarity instead of novelty, presence instead of performance, commitment without announcement. It is the feeling of knowing, this person is part of my life structure, not temporarily, not conditionally, but intentionally. That feeling was present in how Freen and Becky interacted, not loudly but consistently. The small moments that carry the most weight. What fans responded to were not dramatic gestures. They were small, telling moments. How they stood near each other instinctively. How they adjusted to each other's moods. How one softened when the other was present. How attention flowed naturally between them. These are not things people fake well over long periods. These are habits formed through emotional familiarity. And emotional familiarity is the foundation of any real marriage. Why the absence of confirmation made it stronger? In a culture obsessed with labels, confirmation, and announcements, Freen Becky did something radical. They left space. They did not define the relationship for public consumption. They did not offer explanations. They did not clarify rumors. And instead of weakening interest, this deepened it. Because what people were reacting to was not a statement. It was behavior. And behavior is harder to argue with than words. Married energy. And why people felt it immediately. The phrase, married energy, went viral among fans for a reason. Married energy is steady, grounded, protective, emotionally synchronized, does not crave attention, does not need reassurance from outsiders. Freen and Becky moved like two people who trusted their bond, regardless of how it was perceived. That trust is rare. And rarity invites fascination. LGBTQ+ fans and the need for alternative love models. For many LGBTQ+ fans, especially those in conservative environments, traditional marriage is either delayed or impossible. So representation shifts. They look for models of love that show longevity without legality, a devotion without danger, intimacy without exposure. FREENBECKY offered that. They showed that commitment does not require permission to be real. And for many fans that was healing. When a bond becomes a refuge, people don't project onto relationships randomly. They project onto relationships that feel safe. FREENBECKY became a refuge for people who felt unseen, felt rushed by society, felt pressured to define themselves, felt afraid to love openly. Watching a bond exist peacefully without explanation felt like permission to breathe. Marriage without the crowd. There is a quiet truth many people learn too late. The most important relationships in your life are rarely the loudest ones. They are the ones that hold you steady, don't need witnesses, survive silence, exist beyond performance. FREENBECKY represented that kind of marriage. Not officiated but felt. Why this story refuses to fade. Trends fade, tips fade, hype fades, but FREENBECKY stayed. Because it was never about hype. It was about recognition, the feeling of seeing something real in a world full of noise. Conclusion: to be expanded when love doesn't need a ceremony to be true. Marriage, at its core, is not a contract. It is an agreement between two people to move through life together with care. Whether Freen and Becky ever confirm anything is beside the point. What mattered, and still matters, is that they showed the world a different way to understand commitment. One that lives in behavior. One that exists in feeling. One that does not ask permission.